I'm Lee Bristow, host of Saros Insights and Director of Cyber and AI Governance. At Saros, we partner with the world's most recognized brands to make the complex simple. My aim is to deconstruct the strategies of Ireland's top business leaders, from AI governance, digital transformation, and some that are even scaling through acquisition. We're playing a bigger game, uncovering the human stories behind the technology. Welcome to our show. Today on the Saros Insight podcast, we have Pat Moynihan, an independent technology consultant with over 30 years of experience spanning the telecoms and retail industry. He served as the CIO of Primark, CTO of Telefonica O2 Ireland, and IT director at Vodafone Ireland before a brief stint as CTO of the National Lottery. Hi, Pat. Thank you very much for joining us on the Saros Insight podcast. Really great of you to join. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Lee. I'm glad to be here.
So you have 30 years of experience across two very different industries. What has been the thread that has guided you and has almost been your vision across your career?
I guess I would have started, my background originally would have been as a software developer.
Okay.
But I always liked the interactions with people. So I didn't actually spend long writing code, maybe just 2 or 3 years out of the total of the 30 years. Not much in the overall scheme of things, but what I enjoyed was the interaction with people. And I guess I was able to bring this translation effect. So particularly dealing with business people who didn't really want to know about the technology, I was able to explain, that it was a black box and this is what the black box did. You don't really need to worry what's in the black box. So I started on the retail side, actually, which was interesting because, IT was very much a back office function. And it was a big cultural change moving to telecoms because in telecoms, it was very engineering led. So you kind of went from being in the back office in retail to actually now at the very forefront because it was a technology, which is the product that was being sold. So it was a refreshing change. And then it was interesting because I switched back again then. So that was another cultural change going from O2 to Primark, because I think I brought a lot of the lessons I'd learned in telecoms to retail, which was, I think, the reason that they hired normally they like to hire people that had the same experience. So, tell me all the retailers you worked in before. But I think the fact that I worked in the two telecoms operators for the guts of kind of 15, 16 years is what they liked. They wanted me to bring some of that robustness to the retail system. So
when you're moving between these two kind of core industries, you also had to go through technological changes. So that would have been moving from the on-prem into cloud. And you would have seen some of those transitions, maybe not in the telecoms, but definitely in Primark. What was your approach? What was your strategy for dealing with that kind of transformation, the 3G to 4G, and on-prem to cloud? Because fundamentally they're transformation. So as a leader in the C-suite, what was your approach to actually managing those kinds of challenges?
Yeah, I think in both in both industries, after a certain number of years, there was a couple of, givens that I would look for before I would kind of go with a new technology. And, if I think back to my Primark days, particularly, it was a very large volume business. So, I would have constantly suppliers coming in and pitching to me. My first question would be, who are your other customers? How long are you with those other customers? How many products have they got? How many customers have they got? And if they didn't have a good track record behind them, then there was no way I was going bleeding edge. It was as simple as that. I wanted to be a fast follower, but I did want to make sure that they were well proven. And I had a really, started with a small team. It grew over time, but I didn't have the time to prove things either. So I needed tried and tested solutions. On the telecom side, I guess it was, there was more willingness, I think, to take risks because of the engineering and the technology background. People understood it, and they, would be quite happy to, move with the times, if you like. So it was, it was interesting. But if it had been proven, then we went with it and it made a difference. And it was all business case driven. A couple of times I had some programs where there was weak business ownership or no business ownership, and you learn that lesson pretty quick. You're looking for a clap on the back for a fantastic delivery, and nobody cares whether it was delivered. I think that was a waste of time. Let's make sure we have a business owner, begging us to deliver the next time, because otherwise, you really are. And I guess the other thing was, in both these industries, there was always a shortage of resources. You never had enough IT people to deliver the project. So, one of the things that I became quite expert at was coming up with prioritization processes. And I did that, I think, in 3 or 4 different organizations where, everybody's screaming at you for their number one priority, but, you only have enough scope there to deliver a certain amount of it. But in a smaller organization, it's much easier because you can turn to the CEO and the CEO will say, okay, these are the top 3, I want you to deliver those 3. And it doesn't matter what anybody else is looking for, that's what you deliver.
Yeah.
But in the larger organizations, it's important to have some fair way of making sure that you're delivering the ones that make the difference. So I did that several times, and it was, I think people understood, the background behind it. And once it was seen to be fair, then it's kind of stopped them bickering over their favorite one. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that was a key learning for me over the years, I think,
Have you seen situations where it becomes a little bit toxic between senior leadership, or at least the board, and the C-suite, especially around technology and change transformation, hitting up against resource challenges, and it becomes a bit of a bun fight? Have you seen what that looks like, and potentially tools to unwind that?
Yeah, I have. And I guess, in the early days of some of the transformation programs, you would look from a representative, to join the project team. Somebody from finance, somebody from marketing, somebody from, customer experience or the contact center. And, in those early days, when you didn't know any different, you were just glad to get somebody, but quite often you got the weak person. If that weak person was, would cause you more problems than anything else, because you'd go to them and say, okay, are we all squared away from a marketing perspective? And they'd say, yes. And then suddenly holy war breaks out the next board presentation. You're thinking, well, thanks for your help. So I think what I learned was, that those representatives, they need to be the busy people. If they're the busy people in the departments, then, give them you want. They're the people who get the job done, and they will represent their area. And, they need to have a bit of maturity so that they can compromise and do the right thing for the business, rather than, they can be a brilliant, dogged fighter for their own department, but we need to look at the bigger picture. So I think that's one of the big learnings for me. Put a good team of people together, and it's like the A team, really, not the guys who, someone wants to move off, out of their sight. Learn that lesson pretty quick as well. Yeah.
In terms of Primark, they have always been a very traditional business, brick and mortar. That's been their route. They have avoided the digitization route up until quite relatively recently. In terms of success and failure now, what were the projects that were actually that the business walked away from? So it got to the point where there was not enough resources, there was not enough time, the environment had changed. What were the things over that 30-year period where you hit that technology? Because I heard a stat the other day, something like 80% of projects fail, IT projects, but in my experience, that's not actually true. In my lived experience, it's not actually true. So, but there are some spectacular failures that I've had.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking across those large organizations in terms of Primark. And again, you can change the names.
Yeah, no, maybe some of the other, places that I would have. I think sometimes there was very few actually that. So I would agree with your statement that says that is in my experience, because by the time there was a lot of due diligence went into, deciding what it is we were going to do. And invariably we delivered that. I would have said, 99 times out of 100. Where we didn't, it was where it became too big or too complex. And I remember that, one of the consultants at some point from one of the big four saying, once the project goes over, 12 months, then, you really need to be thinking about, because the requirements are changing. Those industries, both telecoms and retail, were moving so quickly that, by the time you were going live, say it was an 18-month project, at the end of the 18 months, then things have changed. So, the requirements that you put together, whether it's waterfall or agile, by the time you get there, things change. So they would be, I think it's where we'd, bit off more than we could chew. I remember actually when I moved from Vodafone to O2, and I remember one of the guys when I joined O2 saying, "Look, Pat, we have to change this billing system." I was kind of saying to them, I'm just in the door. There's loads of people I know who've lost their career on the back of changing the billing system. Let's just sit down and talk about what we've got. And we didn't, but we made improvements, and we improved it incrementally rather than having a 2-year project, that actually never got completed. So they would be, there was certainly, and I've had some opportunities, in the past where people have said, "Look, will you be the program director for this massive transformation program?" And for me, there was far more enjoyment in kind of running a department and delivering, 15 to 20 programs, rather than getting sucked into, the difficulty of those big transformation programs. So I would be very wary. I think I might have ducked that question there, but didn't give you any exact examples. I do have a couple, but
Yeah, no, that was a great political answer.
I'm not going into the details on that. Yeah.
Something that I think you will be able to kind of give quite a bit of detail around, which is you were talking a lot about the high pressure stakes in the telecoms and really pushing the limits in terms of where the technology could go. But at the same time, you needed the 5-9 uptime. So how did you actually build in the resilience piece even under those pressures? Because essentially what you needed to do was have high quality and meet a very strict timeline. So, how did you get that into the mix?
Yeah, like we would have taken, I think in my early days on the telecom side, we certainly would have taken more risk, in terms of it going live with instance 1 and then putting instance 2 in place to, fail over if you have a problem. But
Yeah,
one of the big lessons I learned from telecoms that I brought to Primark was, this idea of having, a second set of infrastructure that's sitting there doing nothing, waiting for the first one to fail, is just a bad idea. And I do have some horror stories of where, when it did fail over, because it wasn't being used all the time, it didn't work. So
yeah,
the brilliant thing about the switching on the telecom side of it is, you have an A and a B, and it's live, and you distribute the traffic between them. And if there's a problem, you just switch all the traffic. And, it makes perfect sense once you've been burnt a couple of times. But, when you're, in the early designs and you haven't the experience, it's like, oh, maybe there's a cheaper option here we can go for. But, it's a false economy, it's certainly. So it would be, I think, things like that I would be watching out for now, Plus then, all the architects and engineers would tell you there's a bulletproof, and you have to find a bulletproof system, to be honest,
When you start thinking about the future of retail, and specifically Primark, and you're looking at the brick and mortar type retailers, when you're thinking about AI and the role that AI can potentially play in personalizing shopping or event moments within that brick and mortar space, is there anything that you have seen or a vision in terms of the future of that technology?
Yeah, I know. I think Primark has come on leaps and bounds, actually. So I moved on to other opportunities, but they have invested a lot and put a lot of effort into, their click and collect now, which is brilliant. But what people, and it's not that, there was business case done many times and it just didn't stand up. It was as simple as that. And so it was about what was the right way to do it, for Primark. So we would have always looked to the market to see what everybody else was doing. But one of the things I remember, and I looked it up, so I could give you a bit of information on this, but like in 2018, Amazon went live with the Amazon Go store in London. I don't know if you're aware of that, but like for me, like that was really cool. So it was a small convenience store, but it was all, it was an Amazon store and it was all Amazon technology. And this was the 2018 now. When you went in, you tapped your phone. That identified you. You had an account, so you were, pre-registered. You had your shopping bag and you picked it off the shelf and you put it into the bag and you changed your mind, you put it back again, you went it around, and then you tapped your phone on the way out and you were billed in the background. For me, like that was just fantastic. And it was based on cameras and sensors.
Yeah.
And I looked up the latest on it and they've closed all those stores. It's a fantastic case study because the technology worked perfectly.
Yeah.
But it's kind of a really good example of where, the technology can work perfectly, but if there isn't a strong business case there for it. So the explanation was that, grocery in the UK is absolutely cutthroat. So making a cool, easy experience wasn't getting the customers away from Sainsbury's or Aldi or Lidl because it's such a cutthroat market. So being cool wasn't enough. So in the end, they closed down all the stores. So it really kind of, I guess, is a good example of where, it's not just having good technology, you need a good business case for it.
So looking ahead, say the next 5 years in terms of some of the technology transformation that you see coming down the road in the organizations that you're working with, and in the industries that you've been, is there anything that kind of keeps you up at night, or do you think it's just, and I'm referring primarily to AI and potentially the loss of jobs within those particular areas, or do you think it's actually a little bit too much of hype or a little too much hype around that?
Yeah, I think I would be really excited by AI, and I think the way I look at it is when I went to college in 1983, believe it or not, there was a phrase going around at the time, which is, one man with a computer is going to do the job of 10 people. So, that was one of the reasons why I decided to do a course in computers. And that turned out to be true.
Yeah.
But it didn't mean that, the other 9 people weren't doing anything. They moved on to, what we used to call higher value work at the time. Does that sound familiar? The exact same thing is being said. Now, AI is another step again, because it's not just about, doing the job, but actually it's applying intelligence. And, I guess the difference is, AI, mightn't take 40 developers' work, but, a smaller team of people can do a broader range of things. But I think that's really exciting. And people, I think, should embrace it and figure out, how do I use that as a tool? So I'm the one man or one woman, that knows how to prompt that AI engine to, do really well. That would be one, and then just on the other thing I would say, like looking back over the time I spent, there's kind of a realization, when you were asking me, does anything keep me awake? It's more around that. There's cycles that happen that are kind of, unless you actually look at it, you kind of think, what's going on here? Are people losing their minds? So it was all on premise. Then it was moved to the cloud. Now it's being moved back on premise. You kind of, is there a never ending cycle here? But you kind of realize that we kind of swing one way or the other. So it's on premise. So let's get rid of it all to the cloud. But actually, no, some of it we should hold on to. So there's a middle ground there. And it isn't just there. I would have had a lot of experience with outsourcing. Okay, let's outsource everything. Okay, there's a few people there, from a strategy perspective that we want ourselves, and I was just looking at it, and there's several things like that, so if you look back in the past, it'll give you a few hints for the future. The other one was, we want to go to one big platform. Well, no, we want best in class in the various areas. And then suddenly you find yourself, I guess the best fit is what you're looking for, rather than following the fashion. But no, I would be really excited by AI. I would be saying people shouldn't be fearful of it, and it needs to be it needs to be managed and controlled, and that's the bit that people need to figure out. How do I trust it, and how do I know? Go back to my original point about that back box does X. You don't need to worry about how it does it, but how do you verify that it's doing it the way you want it? I had a really good conversation with that company where I'm on the board, and I was talking to the CTO, and like he is a real hands-on guy, writes a lot of code, has a team of developers, and he's now producing an awful lot more functionality on the back of using AI actively. Like, it's really impressive. And I trust him, and he has the ability to test and sign off and know that it's okay. Now, if it was someone I didn't know, then I'd be a bit more wary. So I think that's the difference. But I would be really excited by all of that. As long as people, maintain that governance and control, then I think off you go. Fill your boots. Okay.
Pat, thank you very much.
Gee, nice to talk to you. I enjoyed it.
That was fantastic. And thanks very much for your insights and openness.
Great. Thank you very much.